The mythical world of synthesis and synthesizer manufacturers is something I've actually found really fascinating for quite some time now. Something as niche as the electric-powered keyboard has household names in it, which is wild if you really think about that. If you've only been paying attention to synthesizers for even a few days, you probably know the names Moog, Roland, Korg, and Yamaha. Most of these companies began in the 1950s or 1960s, or the 1880s in some cases. What's been fascinating in the last 20 years is to see the rise of brand new synthesizer companies and how they've become the front runners in some cases of what is cool and what's new and innovative in synthesis. Folldorf, founded in 1988, introduced the Blofeld in 2007 and showed how ready that the synth market was for an extremely compact little digital synthesizer with massive modulation options. Founded in 2008, Make Noise introduced the No Coast in 2016, a synthesizer so unique and revolutionary every conversation I've had about it ends in the phrase, "Man, I really need to get one already." Founded in the last few years even, Ashen Sound Machines released the Hydrasynth in 2021, creating what I've read multiple reviews call the new benchmark that all other digital synthesizers should be judged by, finally usurping the Microkorg. God, I hope no one takes that seriously. This is all to say that in the synthesizer world, something can just come up out of nowhere from a company not a whole lot of people have heard of and just take over, and it can become the new hip thing that's happening right now. This is often because the synthesizer has way more features than everything else in its price range, it's this terrifyingly beautiful sounding machine, or it's doing something that nobody else has been doing, and it's doing it really well. Enter Arturia. A French company founded in 1999, Arturia gained a lot of love very early on for their work in the VST world, where they're still killing it to this day. As they've branched into the physical world, Arturia became a powerhouse, releasing products that synth nerds really didn't realize they needed as badly as they did. Their MIDI controllers like the Beat Step and the Key Step and the Pro variants, offering things like CV and 5-pin DIN outputs for control, both being rare in the early 2010s when MIDI over USB was the standard and CV was this very specialist thing for modular nerds. Not only are these controllers extremely well made and they're very quality, they're mass-produced and cheap and you can pick them up pretty much anywhere. It can be argued that the CV expandability of everything that Arturia was putting out might have something to do with the recent bloom of modular in the last couple of years. The MicroBrute, which is Arturia's first analog synthesizer, was released in 2012 and was a keyboard covered in knobs and sliders, a throwback to the much simpler legendary machines like the Moog Rogue and the Roland SH series, but for a super reasonable $500. The only real meat and potatoes mass-produced analog synthesizer of that year, Sound On Sound's Gordon Reed said, "Although we are living in a golden age for analog synthesizers, I can think of no immediate alternative to the MicroBrute. Although more expensive than the MicroBrute, the Mofo is a much more powerful synth, but it lacks a one-function per knob user interface." Arturia became the champions of taking what nobody was doing at the time, mass-producing it, making it affordable, and making a nice quality product that wasn't ripping off anything else, Behringer. That wasn't ripping off anything else, Behringer. That wasn't ripping off anything else, Behringer. This leads us finally to the 2013 release of the MicroBrute, an analog synthesizer so simply laid out and able to do so much. $300 for a fully analog signal path with CV expandability. Warm analog oscillators running through a Steiner-Parker filter that adds purity or wild abrasion. In my opinion, it is truly one of the best budget synthesizers that's ever been mass-produced. It is great for the beginner looking to learn synthesis. It's great for the professional looking for like a nice little Swiss Army knife to throw into their arsenal. It's a wonderful sketchpad for your studio. It's a shredder for live shows. I've owned 3 of these things. I've owned 3 Arturia MicroBrutes, and I've been using them in my music for over 10 years at this point. Don't buy one. Don't buy one of these. I'm serious, don't buy one. Here's why the Arturia MicroBrute sucks. And why I've owned 3. Before getting into the mythos of the MicroBrute, Before digging into the mythos of the MicroBrute, let's actually talk about the synthesizer itself and what it does and what it can and can't do. For starters, it's a very simple little function per knob synth. All the features are arranged and grouped really nicely in a way that actually makes it a great teaching tool for how subtractive synthesis works. We have our oscillator section, we have our filter section, the LFO and the controls are over here, we have an ADSR envelope, and a really nice 64-step sequencer that's super easy to program. If you don't actually know much about synthesis, this workflow makes it really easy to understand. Your oscillator makes the sound, your filter shapes the sound EQ, your envelope shapes the sound relative to time, and the LFO lets you modulate other aspects of that sound. In place of making you choose a single oscillator shape, the MicroBrute actually lets you mix in a sawtooth, square, and triangle wave oscillator. Each one has nice little modulator knobs to add color. The Sawtooth's Ultrasaw adds a nice richness, the pulsed width modulation is great for exploring the square wave, the Metalizer turns that gentle triangle wave into something really bitey. The overtone mixer knob adds in a square wave either an octave below or harmonically a fifth above, kind of depending on where you turn the knob, and to be honest with you, I'm not entirely sure how it works. The synthesizer itself is monophonic, meaning you can play one note at a time, only one. Looking at the Steiner-Parker filter here, we can choose between a low, high, and bandpass filter with a really wide range for both the cutoff and the resonance. There's a knob to make the filter's cutoff move with the envelope automatically, handy for some classic synthesizer tones. There's also the Arturia Signature Brute Factor knob, which, to put simply, is a feedback circuit that makes really fuzzy and unpredictable and uncontrollable sounds, but it sounds pretty nice. The mod wheel can be hard assigned to either attenuate the LFO amount or as a secondary cutoff control, which is super handy for performance. The glide knob allows for portamento control, allowing notes to slide in between each other. The LFO has three options: square, reverse sawtooth, and triangle wave. The rate, syncable to the clock being used by the sequencer, is super versatile, going from tone-generatingly fast to stop and smell the roses slow. I'm really proud of that line. By default, the LFO is attached to the pitch of the oscillator. The ADSR envelope is hardwired to the VCA, though you can disengage that with this. The 64-step sequencer is super easy to program. Select record, hit the notes you want, hit rest if you want to skip a certain note, and then click up to play. Your sequence is recorded on the pattern number you were just on. You have 8 to choose from. Up here is maybe the most interesting part. We have a modular patch bay. Though the synthesizer works perfectly without it, you can assign the envelope or the LFO to modulate the flavorings of the oscillators, the overall pitch, or the cutoff of the filter. These are all typical CV, meaning you actually have Euro, rack, modular interchangeability and stuff. Interchangeability? Connectivity. Words? Speaking of, there's actually CV outputs on the back of the synth, along with 1/4-inch line out and a 3.5mm headphone jack. Worth noting, there's actually a 1/4-inch input as well, so you can do filter processing and stuff. There's no MIDI out, which is kind of a shame, but you can use MIDI over USB and use the synth as a polyphonic MIDI controller with the keys and the mod and pitch wheels and stuff. What's fascinating is that I've actually covered pretty much every aspect of the synth. In my last video where I talked about the Tetra, I kind of scraped the top of the iceberg, but there's so many things I had to leave on the table because I didn't want the video to be 7 hours long. I've discussed every single feature that this thing has. It's pretty meat and potatoes and it's pretty simple, but you can get a lot out of a very simple synthesizer like this. But how does it work in the real world? How does it actually work as a synthesizer?
The real world. Sanford
MicroBrute. The MicroBrute and really Arturia as an analog synth maker as a whole kind of have an interesting reputation in the synth world, in my opinion. I remember the hype around the Mini Brute when you could get like an affordable analog synth for the first time in forever, and a brand new one, like one that hadn't been through 30 years of like abuse and stuff, but no one really seemed to like it. I don't know anyone who had one or toured with one or brought one on stage even. Like most synth people I know actually kind of looked down on them, and especially the MicroBrute. The thing I've heard the most is people kind of call it like, it's like a toy or like a, a good learning synth, and that's about it. And like people are forgetting it's a fully fledged synthesizer. I mean, the best thing I've heard about the MicroBrute from friends of mine is that, oh, it's a great synth to grab if like your real synthesizer breaks when you're on a tour, because you can just hop into any big box music store and there it is for $300 and you can just survive the rest of the tour with it. In essence, that kind of belittles it to being like the Squier stock Stratocaster of the synthesizer world, but is that fair? There's a lot about the MicroBrute too that I totally understand being deal breakers or just such an inconvenience that if you're a synthesizer nerd and you have preferences and these don't line up with them, totally understand. Looking at the device as an actual performance tool, let's talk about the keybed. You have 2 octaves of these mini keys, which are kind of spongy and terrible actually. The keybed doesn't feel that good. There's only 2 octaves, so you don't have that much work for your lead lines and stuff. And mini keys are a completely justifiable no for people, but that's never stopped synthesizer manufacturers before, has it? The other huge aspect of the synth that I've heard people bring up in a lot of ways is the actual sound of the oscillators themselves, and let's talk about that. Digging into the oscillators themselves, a good synthesizer can be made or broken on the oscillators. There's a reason that old Moog synths from the 70s, really simple devices, are still beloved. Case in point, like the Rogue or the Micro Moog even. I just wanted to show off that I have a Micro Moog. It's easy to defend the sound of the MicroBrute. It's like a budget synthesizer, and it's really easy to keep going, oh, it's only $300 brand new, but take price off the table and it kind of does sound thin. It can get really, really nice and low. It can get really pristine. It can get really clean and high, and it has beautiful singing mid-range. It can get super harsh, but all this kind of sounds like it doesn't really have like a heft to it, if that makes sense. It's just a little thin. It's a little missing something. As I started making this video, I actually started playing with it again for the first time in a minute, and I realized, wow, this doesn't sound as good as I remember it sounding. When you compare the MicroBrute to, for example, the Tetra or the Mini Moog even, you can really, really hear a sound difference. Here's the sawtooth wave of all three synths. Here's the square wave of all three synths. Even compressed in a YouTube video, there's a pretty obvious sound difference. Another big factor of the MicroMoog worth mentioning, which is kind of a positive and a negative, is the lack of features, to be honest. I'm not saying it's an incomplete synth, I'm not saying it doesn't have great features, but there are just some cut corners that feel really rough once you've graduated away from this thing and start using like a much more complex synth, and you go, wow, I kind of miss this and that. One LFO is completely fine. You can do a lot with one LFO. My MicroMoog only has one LFO. I just wish that LFO had more options. Like a sample and hold would have been great. You could route that to the pitch and make like the classics 50s, 60s sci-fi, like that sound. It would have been really, really nice to make that on something like this. And I understand it's, you know, budget, they're trying to save money, but that would have been so nice, especially considering it's on the MicroBrute. The lack of a looping feature in the envelope is a little bit of a bummer, especially considering you can use it to modulate certain things with the patch bay, and just only having the one envelope go one time, it's a little limiting, especially when you get used to loopers. The lack of a 5-pin DIN MIDI output is a weird choice to me because this is such a small, compact synth. It's asking to be with other small, compact synths. I've used this thing as the central synth in big synth builds before, in big setups, and this one just kind of being the cheese that stands alone at the end is just weird. Like, it would have been so cool to have this thing also control maybe like my Tetra or maybe something else, but it can only be controlled for something with a keyboard on it? That's kind of a weird call, in my opinion. The 64-step sequencer is really, really nice, and it's a super nice touch, and it's super easy to program, and I've gotten really creative with that in the past. I think I would have preferred an arpeggiator, honestly. There's a reason that like a lot of classic, cheaper synths have one. It's a nice feature, and it's a great way to add like big flourishes in a pinch, and it's kind of hard to do that with this, honestly. All of that said, there's a number of reasons I keep coming back to this thing. There's a number of reasons I've owned 3 of these devices. No, it's not the most comfortable synth in the world to play. Yes, it's very limited. No, it's not the greatest sounding synth in the world. But I've still taken this thing on stage a number of times. I used to play drums and synth in this post-rock band, and for a good long while, my setup was this thing through a Line 6 DL4, and if I was feeling a little bit spicy, I'd throw like a Hall of Fame reverb in there. I'd jump back and forth between the drum kit and the synth and just make these giant walls of sound with really just the delay and the loop functions of the DL4, and this thing would sound amazing through that. Just, you would build these really lush walls of sound. The cool thing too was, because it's so simple, I could actually just really quickly make patches on the fly, and this thing actually taught me to like know what I'm doing in a really quick amount of time, because you're on stage, you have a nice warm analog synth, you better make that time count. Speaking of stage, I've never been worried about bringing one of these things to a show. I mean, my MicroMoog, obviously it sounds amazing, it's never gonna see the inside of a venue. What if somebody steals like a beer on it? What if somebody steals it? If somebody steals one of these things, yes, that would suck. It would be the worst, but $300, if I'm on tour, I can just walk into any big box store and grab one for $300. There's a reason it has that reputation, is because you can do that. Versus like, you know, even my Tetra, I'd have to go on Reverb and try to find one, and somebody rose the price of those things on Reverb a whole bunch because of a video essay that they made. I'm really sorry about that. That was not my intention. I goobered that one up, I'm not gonna lie. It's still a really good synth, and if you haven't seen that video essay, here's a link to it up above. No, it doesn't sound as good as like the Tetra or the MicroMoog or even like the MicroBrute in my opinion, but like, let's talk about how good a synth needs to really sound for like a live show. You're running your synthesizer through a PA, maybe you're running it through an amp, and in my opinion, you should also be running it through some reverb if you want to get some like nice sparkly sounds, or maybe even a delay. That will really make some stuff sing. In all likeliness, you have somebody actually running sound and mixing everything together. You have your synth being mixed in with, for example, a guitar running through an amp that's mic'd up, or a bass, or a drum kit, and or all 3. Your synth isn't gonna get buried, but it's not gonna stick out in the same way that you think it is just because you're on stage with it. This isn't to say that sound quality isn't important, but do keep in mind when it comes to live performance and synthesizers, you're one of the instruments. If you're the main instrument, you probably have more going on than just this guy. There's not gonna be a lot of people looking at you when you're on stage and going like, oh, that's weird, that synth doesn't sound as good as a Korg monopoly. For that matter, there's probably a lot of people in that audience who've never heard of the company Arturia. If you're playing well, they're just gonna be enjoying the music, and that's kind of the most important thing. I feel like there's this weird problem we've convinced ourselves of, especially in the synth world, and especially in the last few years, where it's really important that you're using like super nice gear on a stage, because it's totally gonna drastically change the sound of your band. If you know what you're doing, you can get really, really good synth sounds out of anything that'll give you the controls to do so. And let's take off the stage, for example. I've brought this thing into studios before. That same band I was talking about earlier, we recorded a 5-song EP in a very professional studio, and the producer loved this thing. I ran it through the DL4 in the Hall of Fame, and he was just like, wow, that sounds great. It was featured front and center a couple times. It's a really, really, really nice synth for that. And that's not to say, yeah, see, it doesn't matter what you play live, or yeah, you know, you need to have like nicer gear or less nice gear, or you need to drown everything in reverb and delay. But it is to say that writing this thing off as like a learning tool only, or like a budget synth, really writes off the fact that it is a nice synthesizer that can do really nice synthesizer things. And again, it does sound really good. I mean, like, here's a montage of me making crazy good sounds with it. There was no mixing on any of that. There was no post-processing on any of that. All of that was just straight line in. Some of these sounds I can't even get with my other synths, like the ones that I love dearly, like the Tetra or the MicroMode. That overtone oscillator that goes like below and kind of above, Tetra can't do that. The input processing, the Tetra can't do that. Bandpass, high pass,
you can't do that on Tetra.
There's a reason that it shows up in like the video game and indie covers that I do, where like it's standing alongside, not behind, but alongside the Tetra, my old Pulse 2, my MicroMode, a lot of stuff. It holds up, it holds its own, it's a powerful synth in that way. I really like it. And I feel like I'm bringing this up maybe a little bit too much, but I am gonna say again, $300. $300 for a brand new, fully analog synthesizer. And let's take analog out of the room for a second even. $300 for a fully functional synthesizer is a good deal. Like, I've heard the argument a lot, and I'll make the argument too. It's a great first synthesizer. If you decide you don't like it, you can sell it, and honestly, for the money you would sell this thing for, you could pick up a decent guitar or a decent bass. By comparison, for example, like the Tetra, this is an amazing synthesizer. I'm gonna link the video again. If you don't know anything about synthesis, this is a nightmare to program. This thing is bewildering. There's a reason that it comes with a bajillion presets, and if you want to pick one, that's great, but if you don't know anything about synthesis, starting here, the synthesizer that kicked off my journey of being into this world of being able to shape your own sound from the ground up was the Korg XL. It's an underrated little synth, but like, programming on it was a really, really huge pain, and I never really fully understood how to be honest with you. I kind of brute forced my way learning synthesis by playing with like one of the editor that came with it, and just sort of tweaking things and never really fully understanding what they did. I actually sold that and bought my very first one of these, and that was when I felt like I was a synth player, not just like a creative keyboardist, but like this thing actually taught me synthesis. And I'll always be thankful for that. Like, I really cannot express how much I actually love this little synth. This is like one of my favorite synthesizers, and I've owned a lot of stuff over the years, and like, for 300 bucks, I can't recommend this thing enough. Let's talk about the title card of this chapter real quick. Here, that one. I want to focus on something for a second. I've owned 3 of these things. Now you might be asking yourself, oh, like, did you sell them? Have you given some away? Did they get stolen? Why have you owned 3 of these things? Here's the thing with the MicroBrute. There's one flaw. There's one little tiny flaw with this device. One teeny tiny little insignificant true story. So a couple months ago, I injured my hand and I couldn't make covers for a little while, and I threw around the idea of like, what if I made some video essays talking about some music gear that I really like, or I really hate, or I find really annoying? As I was coming up for ideas for essays and really just things to talk about, one of the first ones I came up with was a defense of the Arturia MicroBrute. That was the title of the video, that was where the script was heading. I spent a really, really long time talking about how much I loved the synth. I spent a number of pages talking about why I think it's an extremely underrated device. Everything I just said just now rings true. I do think it's a great sounding synth. I think it's a phenomenal learning tool. I think it's an underrated little guy to just like throw in your setup and like have in your pile of synthesizers, because like it does make some cool sounds I really can't get elsewhere. I was a good ways of the way through making that script, and I sat down with the MicroBrute one night and just turned it on to make sure like everything I was saying made sense, because I was talking about the Ultra Saw and I was talking about the Metalizer, and I just wanted to make sure it was still as cool as I thought it was. Quick side note, everything you see behind me, this is the wall of death. This is all of my dead synthesizers and electronics. My MicroBrute wouldn't turn on. I don't know why, it just didn't turn on. I was making a defense of it and it just didn't turn on one day. This is the third time I've had a MicroBrute die on me. This is the third time I've had a MicroBrute die on me. The first one I was mid-jam, I was like playing with my loop pedal and making these cool little walls of sound, this nice little vegetation. I heard this loud pop, and then suddenly I couldn't get any of the oscillators to make any noise. I know it was the oscillators because I ran an input in just to see, and the filter was working totally fine. It was just the oscillators. Something popped, none of the synth sounds were making synth sounds. Okay. I ended up keeping that MicroBrute and using it as a MIDI controller for a little while, until I finally just bought a real MIDI controller, and then I took it apart and put it on the wall of death. That's what these circuits are right here. That was actually my first MicroBrute. I sold my Microkorg XL for those circuit boards. To replace that, I bought a second MicroBrute because, you know, who knows, fluke thing. A couple years later, I was jamming, and lo and behold, I heard a loud popping sound again. This time it seems like the filter died on me, because you could turn the volume all the way up and you could run it through like a lot of gain through an amp. You could hear the tiniest little bit of stuff, but the filter wasn't doing anything. Maybe it was a blown amp, but also the filter wasn't reacting to anything at all, and even like input processing didn't do anything. I'm still not entirely sure what happened. My most recent death, I don't know why it's not turning on. It just won't turn on, and I don't honestly know why. The frustrating thing is I bought a 3-year extended warranty, and it broke weeks after the 3-year extended warranty ended. Bit of a side note here, but there's an interesting phenomenon in like the synth tuber and really like the synth reviewer. When we talk about build quality, we're not talking about a really important aspect of it, which is longevity. Build quality kind of ties down to like, oh, are the knobs wobbly? Does the key bed feel secure? Does everything feel like it's made really well? Most synthesizers are. They're mass-produced and they're engineered to feel that way. The problem is that it doesn't cover like, is the internal wiring good? Is the heat distribution of the inside of the synth good? Is it gonna survive a tour or a couple of shows even? And I'm not knocking any synth reviewers at all, because you can't really test longevity in a few-week period. If you're getting a synth for review, you can't take it to a show if you're under an NDA. You can't bring it on tour. You can't even take it to a stage, because you're not really allowed to have people know you have this thing. So how can you road test it? If you only have it for a few weeks, how can you know it's gonna last for a few years? And that's the problem with the Arturia MicroBrute, is that they don't last a few years. I've had 3 of these things. I've brought them on the road. I've never toured any of them, but I've always brought them to shows in a case and always protected, and I always kept really good care of them. Nothing ever got beat up more than like standard wear and tear of playing shows, which is a lot, but I never threw anything. Like, my Tetra has been way more abused than any of these things ever were, and I've never had any issues with that. What's frustrating is that the build quality that we talk about in reviews is, this thing is built extremely well. It's super rugged. The pitch and the mod wheel, they both feel really good. All the knobs feel really, really good. It's a cramped space, but it doesn't feel cramped. Nothing takes too little effort that when you bump one knob, you bump all of them, and then you might throw your whole patch out of whack. At the same time, it doesn't take this tremendous amount of finger muscle to turn a knob. It's a really, really nice sweet spot. Arturia made a very well-built machine here. I wouldn't go so far as to say that this thing is built like a tank, which is a phrase I like saying in these reviews, but it's built extremely well. And the super high failure rate is something you can be like, oh yeah, it's a $300 synth, just buy another one. It's a budget synth. This is one of the OG microkorgs. This is one of the ones that came out in the mid-2000s, as far as I can tell. I desperately need to clean that one out, and I desperately need to go in and actually fix some of the keys, but it still turns on. It still works. All the knobs are fine, there's no issues with that. When they came out, they were $400. I have friends who are all about like the Alesis Micron. I've never heard anyone complain about it crapping out or doing anything or acting faulty in any way. That's a really well-built synth. The Yamaha Reface series, I see these synths being toured. I see indie bands have these be their main sound modules on stage. and they're still cheap, they're still on the budget price range, and they look like toys. Just because the synthesizer is under $600 does not mean it's a budget synth, and it should be expected to only last a little while. And what's frustrating too is it's so easy to forget how much money things actually cost in the synth world, because the synth world is very expensive. Let's address the elephant in the room. $300 is a lot of money. You get like a $300 guitar or bass and like, you spend a couple bucks making some adjustments to it, that could be your stock guitar. That could be your workhorse for musical pits or something. My nicer drum kit was $300 and I bought it on eBay. It's been my workhorse. I've brought it to studios, I've brought it on tours. It was a $300 shell pack. For $299, you can buy FL Studio's producer pack and you get this insane collection of VSTs that you make all these like super wacky sounds. You still have $1 left over for coffee. In the synth world, we forget that like $300, it's like, oh, that's on the cheaper side of things. That's not an excuse for bad build quality. That is not an excuse for 3 of these things dying in a decade. And you might even be asking yourself like, okay, dude, you're the one who bought 3 of these things. You're the one who like is subjecting yourself to a new one. Clearly, you have 3 dead ones on the wall. You clearly bought a 4th. That's where you're wrong, kiddo. My dear friend Drew was super nice and let me borrow this for a couple days. I told him, full disclosure, I'm making a video talking about how these things keep dying and nobody should own one of these. For the record, he thought it was funny and lent it to me. Thanks, Drew. When I was looking to replace my MicroBrute, I said to myself, okay, if I had a $300 budget and I could buy something used, maybe not a MicroBrute, maybe something else, what would I get? This right here, oh, this thing's so heavy. So I recently picked up the MicroBrute 2. This is a crazy device. It's made by Arturia. It's a sequel to the MicroBrute, which is, the big brother of the MicroBrute. When they announced the MicroBrute 2, I got so excited because it came with so many features that I had been wanting out of a MicroBrute, that I've been wanting out of the MicroBrute even. You have this giant patch bay that you can like connect anything to anything else. It's stock CV, like compatible with all the Eurorack stuff, so you can absolutely connect it with your modular stuff. I might even start getting into modular synthesizers. I don't have the money to do this, but I might start getting into this because there's just ways of expanding the sounds on this thing that I'm so excited about. Arturia actually makes like a Eurorack like case that attaches to the MicroBrute because they know. They sneaky. It's got so many features that the MicroBrute just doesn't have, the things that I've been wanting. It's got a sample and hold for the LFO. Not only does it have a sequencer, it has a really expandable arpeggiator that's really, really nice. It has these lovely full-size keys. They have aftertouch on them. Do you think this thing has aftertouch? Do you think that this thing has aftertouch? Sorry, Drew. Not only do you have like a stock ADSR envelope, you have an AD envelope with a loop on it, and it's awesome. It's like, you get all these like super crunchy sounds on it, but then you get these super long form sounds on it. And this might also be placebo, but I swear this thing sounds so much better than the MicroBrute. I bought it for $300 bucks. I will also say, at the time of recording, these things are not $300 used typically. That was a deal, that was a crazy deal, and I know it was. But I've been playing with it like every day since I've gotten it, and it's just like, I keep finding fun new sounds. I feel like really motivated to play synth again, honestly. I've been getting sounds out of this thing that I haven't been getting electronically without like playing with a DAW or like just really trying to break a synthesizer, and it's like really fun. The downside, and the thing that I'm kind of worried about, is I'm curious to see how long it lasts. I mean, this thing came out in 2017. I don't know when the specific one was manufactured, and I bought it used, but so far the build quality is a lot nicer, and it feels a lot more stable than, this little dinky guy right here. What was that voice I was just doing? And it's a weird thing to say because clearly it's made of a lot of the same parts, like the sliders and the knobs are clearly Homoousian. And I don't for a second regret not buying a second MicroBrute. Like, if one shows up for like 50 bucks used, I might grab it. I might grab it. But honestly, I feel so burned. I feel so burned that I had to go through 3 synthesizers in a decade. I'm still a little dubious of the MicroBrute 2. It could die tomorrow, I don't know. I hope it doesn't, and I don't think I'll be replacing it if it does, but like, it's kind of paved over the love that I've had for the MicroBrute, honestly. I'm not buying another one. The ones I have can live on the wall of death. I really hate that I can't end this video on like the high note of just like, I love this thing, I recommend this thing. Like, I love cheerleading for gear. You know I do. You've seen the videos. You know I'd like to find optimism where I can. I'd love to be like, oh, for all of its faults, it's still a really wonderful synthesizer. Genuinely, I do think that way. I think it's like a quirky little synth, and I think it sounds really good for being a quirky little synth. I think it's fun. I think it's great. This is like one of the greatest teaching tools that I've ever learned off personally, and I think it's a wonderful, wonderful device in that way. I think it's a great sounding synth. I think it's a really fun little synth. I think it has some really, really cool features to it that I wish other synths had, honestly. I'd even go so far as to say if you could find one used for like 150, maybe consider buying it if you don't expect it to last that long. I will always have a place in my heart for the MicroBrute. I really do like this synthesizer a lot. I owe it a lot, I feel like. But just, if it was made to last, it'd be a better synth. It would be a good synth then. The fatality rate is inexcusable. It just is, especially considering I've owned so many different synthesizers over the years. I've bought and sold a lot of stuff, and this is one of two that I've ever purchased, replaced, and then had the replacement break on. We'll get to you someday, Mini Nova. We'll get to you someday. I have defended this thing in conversation so many times. I have recommended it so many times in the past and been like, yeah, if this is a good first synth, and I just don't feel like I can do that anymore. Let me break down my overall thoughts on this thing real quick. Do I recommend the Arturia MicroBrute? No, I don't. And that pains me to say that. Do I recommend it if you find one for like $100? Yeah, I mean, that's still a lot of money, but if you can swing it and you don't mind the fact that it might die, it's still a very fun little device. Do I recommend owning 3 of them? No. And I'm the king of the circus for that. Learn from my mistakes. Avoid the MicroBrute. This video is very cathartic to make. I've been wanting to talk about this for a while because, God, I feel so betrayed by this thing. Leave a comment down below if you've actually owned one of these or if you've had similar issues with it, or if you've never had issues. Maybe I had 3 bad units, I don't know. Let me know if you like the synth, let me know if you hate the synth, let me know what else you want me to talk about, because I'm looking forward to making a lot more like gear reviews and stuff. I want to give a huge shout out to the people on my Patreon. They've been supporting me for a long time and it's been really, really lovely, and it's like really heartwarming that I can be like, hey, I'm gonna make videos. People are like, cool, keep doing it, man. I really appreciate that, like genuinely, that is so cool. If you like this video and you really like these video essays, please subscribe and please let me know and like the video and share it with your friends, and wow, I'm turning into a YouTuber. If you have any questions, so do I. And that's all I can really think of to say, so thank you for watching, subscribe, hit the bell. Is there still a bell on YouTube? And that's all I can think of to say, so I'm going to end the video now, and I hope you have a great day. Stay safe.